Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Live on Bloomberg TV and radio as we are pretty much every day, are keeping track of the latest when it comes to tariffs. After President Trump, of course, today floated the idea of an 80% tariff on China, much lower than the current 145% cumulative rate, seeming right, leaving it up to the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent as he makes tracks to Switzerland for talks alongside the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer with China that begin tomorrow. And we're trying to get as much insight as we can into the thinking of this administration around trade ahead of that meeting and the aftermath of the framework agreed to between the U.S. and the U.K. yesterday. And we got some of that from Peter Navarro earlier on Bloomberg Surveillance. He's White House Director of the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, and he had this to share with our colleagues.
All we're doing is trying to level the playing field. I saw the EU kind of rattling sabers, I think it was yesterday, about some kind of retaliation. And I would just say to anybody who's in the European Union, I mean, how can you look us in the face and threaten us when your tariffs are higher? You have lost cases repeatedly at the WTO on us selling you things like beef and poultry, and you won't even honor that. So
Peter, yesterday the president called Ursula von der Leyen fantastic, and he said he hopes to meet her. But are you saying that the European Union is not as high on the priority list than, say, other trading partners like South Korea and Japan?
Not at all. I mean, the EU, to be clear here, we have the second highest trade deficit with the EU behind China. So they're very high on the list. All I'm saying here is that I found it unfortunate that the EU kind of fired, I think some term was fired shots across our bow. It's like retaliation will not work against the United States. We shouldn't have that. Let's talk. Let's figure this out. And it would be nice. Here, let's give peace a chance here. All we're asking for here in the United States of America is fairness. I mean, would you agree? Is there any disagreement on this set and on your set that the tariffs of the EU are higher and that the non-tariff barriers are higher, and that the WTO in Geneva is basically sanctioning that through two things?
Okay, but
one
Peter,
is the but would you agree with that?
I mean, I think that there's a bigger question.
Fact check there.
There's a bigger question here. There's a bigger question here, and this is something that the German finance minister has come out and talked about, which is they'd be willing to drop all tariffs to zero if the U.S. were willing to drop all tariffs to zero. There is a willingness to negotiate around the board to a lower tariff regime. Would that be acceptable to you, or is 10% the new floor?
So let's stay with that. See, that's such a misdirection, okay? It's the non-tariff barriers, stupid, to kind of paraphrase Bill Clinton. It's like it's the non-tariff barriers. So when countries like Vietnam or entities like the EU say to us, oh, let's all go to zero tariffs and everything will be okay, that's not the problem. It's part of the problem, but the bigger problem is the non-tariff barriers. In Europe, it's the VAT tax.
So Peter Navarro choosing to focus on non-tariff barriers rather than the question around this 10% baseline tariff rate that still remains, which is what my colleague Lisa Abramowitz was asking about. And we actually heard from the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt about that. She's still briefing the press from the briefing room as we speak, saying she had just heard from President Trump that he is determined on that 10% baseline tariff, that he is committed to it. So I guess there's your answer, at least for now. She also, of course, was asked about the president's musing on True Social today, suggesting that 80% was a tariff level on China that seems right. This is how the press secretary addressed that.
The president still remains with his position that he is not going to unilaterally bring down tariffs on China. We need to see concessions from them as well. And again, that's part of the reason that Secretary Bessent is going to talk to his Chinese counterparts this weekend to start those discussions in person. As for the 80% number, that was a number the president threw out there, and we'll see what happens this weekend. And always in the effort of transparency, I'm sure you'll hear directly from the Treasury Secretary or the president.
And as we wait to hear from the Treasury Secretary or the President. We add a voice of experience here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Nazak Nakakhtar is with me. She's National Security Practice Group Lead at Wiley Rein, former Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at the International Trade Administration as well. Nazak, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. As we consider this number that was thrown out there, to paraphrase the words of the press secretary today by President Trump, that the tariff rate on China be brought from 145% down to 80%, even at that level, what does that really fix? What trade can realistically happen with tariffs still that high?
Great to be with you again. That's a really important number because when we look at our trading relationship with China, we have two key issues. We have massive market access barriers to exports of goods and services into China. And then we have China's distorted command style economic system where the government pulls every possible lever of the economy, including, raw material, electricity, land, labor, certainly prices, to underprice the United States. And what I found out through my 25 years of experience dealing with trade with China, representing domestic industries, Chinese goods are typically valued at about 60, 70%, in many instances less than U.S. products. So yeah, I think the president, if he needs to point to numbers to justify his 80%, I don't think he's going to have to look farther than looking at China's market access barriers and China's level of underpricing that is aided and abetted by the Chinese government pulling these levers of the Chinese economy to underprice us. So he's essentially sort of level the playing field. Yeah.
If you see justification for that number, do you have confidence that they actually could walk away from talks in Switzerland tomorrow at a number like that, given your vast experience in dealing with China on trade issues? Are they going to be a willing partner in these conversations here, Nazak? Do you think tangible outcomes are possible in the short term?
Look, I think if the Chinese press the president or Secretary Bessent and Ambassador Greer on the 80%, it's going to be easy for them for the U.S. administration to justify it. But I don't want to. It's impossible to overstate how difficult these negotiations are going to be. The U.S. is looking for the Chinese government to not only open up the markets for U.S. businesses, but really to reform their economy so the U.S. market, doesn't have to deal with these distortions that arise from the Chinese government intervening so much in the economy, including currency manipulation to underprice. But it's going to be very difficult to press for that because the Chinese government needs that to retain its position as the global manufacturer. So what we ask for, the Chinese government may not be able to give. And so the big question for Secretary Bessent and Ambassador Greer is, where do you find compromise? And can you find compromise at all? The Chinese are pretty much going to, I think, stand firm on what their demands are, which are continued access to the U.S. market and technology transfer from the U.S. to China. And those are things that the administration might not be too keen to give.
Well, on your point about the kind of manufacturing overcapacity, the flooding of global markets with Chinese supply, this is not a unique idea to this administration. We heard plenty about this during the Biden administration as well. This is something that the Treasury Secretary then, Janet Yellen, was incredibly focused on. But is the difficulty with that in particular, not just in asking China to make kind of structural changes to the economy, as you described, also that the U.S. can't necessarily force that alone when China has plenty of other buyers who may be willing to take that supply? Is it that the U.S. actually needs other countries to cooperate with this effort? Because when I spoke to the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, about this yesterday, he kind of pushed back on the idea that they're asking that of other countries to counter China.
That's a great question, and you hit the nail on the head. Look, the dynamic is when China floods the global markets with cheap goods, right? And steel and aluminum, that's kind of when the world started waking up to China's overcapacity. But now we have autos, we have semiconductors, optical fiber cables, the list goes on, right? What happens there is that it collapses global prices. And then producers in other markets can't sell in their markets, can't sell in markets abroad. So then they end up redirecting their product to the United States, which is why the tariffs that the president had imposed on steel and aluminum, in part, just to put the wall around the United States, prevented us from feeling that effect of China's overcapacity. So on one hand, Secretary Bessent is right, and on the other hand, there's a counter argument. One, if we just put barriers around ourselves to sort of shield us in the United States from overcapacity, does that kind of take care of the problem? Yes. And we saw that example with steel and aluminum. But at the end of the day, we can't have our allies' markets collapse either by virtue of China's overcapacity, because it's having the same effect on our allies that it is on the United States. So it's really incumbent on the United States to kind of give them top cover to be able to push back. The thing I want to really emphasize is that when we imposed the steel and aluminum tariffs, many of our allies started getting flooded with cheap Chinese steel and aluminum. So they started erecting safeguards around their borders to shield themselves from China's overcapacity. So I think we're going to get there. It's really incumbent on us to give our allies cover so they could do the same and push back on China.
Well, one ally, the UK, now has a framework, at least trade agreement with the U.S. that does include taking down tariffs on steel and aluminum in particular, as well as kind of other sectoral elements, including this 100,000 auto quota where the tariff rate is only 10%. And I wonder what you make of that framework we learned about yesterday, knowing there's still details that need to be filled in, Nazak, and if you see that as being a kind of reliable blueprint that other countries might look to follow, or just being unique to the UK specifically.
It's an important sort of signaling tool, right? I mean, there's elements of the deal that are really good, increased market access for agriculture in addition to the items you said. Market access, I think the U.S. government is estimating an increase of $5 billion. Still, the 10% tariffs remain on most goods from the UK. That'll raise $6 billion in tariff revenue from the United States. UK tariffs on the United States drops from 5.1% to 1.8%. That's a big deal. So there's a lot of good there. And I think what the president really wanted to do was quickly get a deal, a big deal that signaled to other countries, look, a deal with the United States is possible. We don't have to continue to be enemies. Peter, who was on just a little bit earlier, Peter Navarro, is right. Our allies in Europe, most of these European countries, if you combine their tariff and non-tariff barrier equivalents and convert it into a tariff rate, it's about 13% on the United States. Before the Trump administration, the tariff rates of the United States were about 1.6% applied tariff. So you see this huge disparity. So I think with Trump, again, the Trump administration is really at least hoping a signal to the markets is, we want to work with our allies again. We want to get to trade deals that open up both of our markets. And if we can do that, if we can integrate our economies with those of our allies, now we have a hope of pushing back against China. And let's be clear, Europe doesn't have to rely on the Chinese market anymore. Integrate your supply chains with the United States. I think this is what Trump's trying to signal. Integrate your supply chains with the United States. Neither of us are going to be dependent on China, and our economies are going to be stronger. I hope the president can execute that strategy, but we'll see what happens in Switzerland.
Indeed, we will. Nazak, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Nazak Nakakhtar, National Security Practice Group Lead at Wiley Rein, and former Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at the International Trade Administration, joining me here on the early edition of Balance of Power.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Very happy Friday to you. Happy Friday to everyone. We are on the cusp of the weekend here, although for many in Congress, the weekend has already started. They've already left Washington doing so, with some major questions still remaining on Republicans' budget reconciliation package that they're trying to pass in the House, at least, before Memorial Day. A number of outstanding issues still, even as we look ahead to two key markups that are scheduled for Tuesday. In the Energy and Commerce Committee, which has to make decisions about Medicaid cuts, and in the Ways and Means Committee, which is charged with crafting the entirety of the tax portion of this package. That means making a decision on what happens with the SALT cap, whether or not the president gets things like no tax on tips or overtime or Social Security. and maybe whether or not to raise taxes on the wealthy. After Bloomberg's Eric Wasson had a scoop yesterday that the president himself actually talked to the Speaker of the House about raising the rate on those making $2.5 million or more for a single person, $5 million for a couple, to 39.6%. I asked the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, about that proposal last night on Balance of Power. This is what he told me.
The president's trying to make sure he gets no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, and no tax on Social Security. And if he says, look, the richest Americans, remember, he cut it from 39.6 to 37. So if he just goes back to what he did last time, I'm in favor of that. I think it's smart, as long as it's a redistribution to his priorities of no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, and no tax on Social Security. I think it's smart.
So Lutnick is in favor, but is the president himself actually in favor of this or just willing to tolerate it? Because this is what he said on Truth Social earlier today, quote, "The problem with even a tiny tax increase for the rich, which I and all others would graciously accept in order to help the lower and middle income workers, is that the radical left Democratic lunatics would go around screaming, 'Read my lips,' the fabled quote by George Bush the elder that is said to have cost him the election. No, Ross Perot cost him the election. In any event, Republicans should probably not do it, but I'm okay if they do. So, will they?" It's on that note we turn to Bloomberg's Eric Wasson as well as Wendy Benjaminson, who's here with me in our Washington, D.C. studio. We find Eric on Capitol Hill, where he spends a lot of his time these days covering Congress for us. And Eric, given that this was your reporting initially that I'm referencing here, this 39.6% tax rate for a party that, by and large, is in it to cut taxes, not raise taxes on anyone. Is this actually something that could happen in this House of Representatives?
No, I really don't think so. It would take an enormous push from President Trump if he had come out on Truth Social and really doubled down on what he said privately to the speaker and pushed them to do it. Trump can move mountains in this party. He's taken over the party for all intents and purposes. But his ambivalent Truth Social post really makes me think this thing is dead. We saw Mike Crapo, who's the top tax writer in the Senate, go on the Hugh Hewitt show and pan this idea. We know most Republicans in leadership positions are against it. I just don't see it happening. That being said, I think the president does have good political instincts. It would play well. The biggest attacks from Democrats will be this is a billionaire tax cut funded by cutting Medicaid for the poorest. And that's going to sting them in the midterm elections, I predict. But I don't think the president's going to be able to get that rate increase.
And I want to talk about the political calculations here with Wendy as well. But first, Eric, on this suggestion, and Howard Lutnick was kind of speaking to this, that they would consider this because they need to find the money somewhere to fund all of these other tax cuts. If it's not going to be raising taxes on the wealthy, and it's also potentially not going to be cutting Medicaid as much as is prescribed in the budget for the Energy and Commerce Committee, where do you come up with that? Or does that just mean you can't cut all the taxes the president wants?
Yeah, it's a tale of two cities, tale of two chambers. The House is where the issue of spending cuts is really salient. You've got a group of conservatives who just really want to see at least $2 trillion, or in some cases $1.5 trillion, in exchange for $4 trillion in tax cuts. The Senate has given itself permission in its budget to essentially barely cut spending at all, just $4 billion. And basically use a budget gimmick to say that this is extending the existing tax cuts costs $0 because it's current policy. At the end of the day, a lot of people up here think that the Senate will get its way. There's not the appetite in the Senate for this type of spending cuts, and the deficit hawks, to the extent they are deficit hawks, will just swallow it in the House. I'm not sure that's the case. It's going to be a protracted fight. But the real problem right now in the House is they can't get the House moderates to sign on to these deep Medicaid cuts, and they're going to have to lower their tax appetite. I'm looking at perhaps maybe 3 or 4 years only of this no tax on tips and no tax on overtime. They just can't afford a 10-year package, and maybe everything else gets scaled back to just 4 years and say you'd have to reelect Republicans in 2028 to get it extended.
Well, and it is the question of whether or not the Republicans can get reelected that's at play here. Wendy, to the point Eric was making, Democrats' argument has made they're only trying to cut taxes for the rich. They're going to cut Medicaid. They don't care about lower and middle income people. But if, for whatever reason, even if Eric is a little bit skeptical about this, we end up with a higher tax bracket for those who are millionaires and we don't end up with as steep Medicaid cuts, that really makes complicated the messaging of the other side.
It does. And Democrats will have their own problems finding the messaging. But there's a lot of chess moving at play here. The tariffs that Donald Trump has been championing hurt his base. It will raise consumer prices for goods made in China, Mexico, things like that. It will raise the cost of American cars. And so he knows, he does have good political instincts, and he knows that has hurt his base voters. So he answers that with, well, but look how populist I am. I'm going to raise taxes on millionaires, which he says he would graciously accept to pay. And we saw evidence in the first term that he doesn't pay the taxes he owes anyway. So, who knows if he'll actually pay it. But then he realizes that this may not raise enough money, that it puts Republicans in a bind who are in districts with high-income earners, and therefore now he's got to sort of back off of it and say, I don't really want to do it, but if you want to, I'm okay. And that gives him the cover to not be responsible. It will be, look at those crazy House Republicans, they raise taxes on the rich just so I could cut taxes elsewhere.
Well, but I feel like we've had this conversation a few times, whether it's the election of a speaker or other matters in the House, that ultimately the president, or one bill or two. We've obviously now settled on one big, beautiful bill, but for a while, President Trump was leaving things open on that front too. Have we not learned he has to make a decision and enforce it among the ranks of Republicans on Capitol Hill for anything to actually get done?
Yes. I mean, the way, as Eric says, the way he has remade the party, he has made it so that he makes every single decision that is coming forward and doesn't leave it to, the House Speaker or the Senate Majority Leader to be able to whip their voters into a bill that they know will pass and will protect them politically. They are only interested in what Donald Trump thinks, and that leaves them in a real bind.
Well, you're especially in a bind, Eric, if you're in one of these blue state districts, or maybe a member of the so-called SALT caucus. As we know, the SALT cap is very much still up for debate. The speaker has floated raising it to $30,000 from the current $10,000, and at least one SALT district member, Nicole Malliotakis of New York, is suggesting that's a number that she's okay with. My question is that going to be enough to satisfy everybody else?
It's really not. Malliotakis was kind of the weakest link in the SALT caucus block. We saw the five other members, including from New York State, including Mike Lawler, Andrew Garbarino, Nick LaLota, being much firmer. And then they were joined by Elise Stefanik. Very interesting move by her. She had not been a player on the SALT issue. There's talk of her running for governor of New York, and she suddenly got in on these meetings where she had been absent before, and then she was part of a statement rejecting the $30,000 yesterday. Young Kim, and a very vulnerable Republican in California, also rejected the offer. We haven't heard from Tom Kaine, who's a bit of a silent figure up here on Capitol Hill of New Jersey, but he's a very SALT-heavy district in the western part of the state. I suspect he's against it, but keeping his cards closer to his chest. So, this is going to continue to be negotiated. One thing we might see, this was a flat $30,000. We might see them double it for couples. There's been a lot of, I talk about the marriage penalty under SALT. But Young Kim had come out and said she wants $62,000 for an individual. I think she has a much more wealthy district. So we'll see. They can afford to maybe lose one, but they already know there's certain people like Thomas Massey who are going to vote no on any tax bill, and they can only afford to lose two or three. So it's going to come down to the wire on the House floor.
Well, and when we consider these members in particular, Wendy, I wonder how much leverage they have, knowing that if they decide not to vote for a tax package at all and the 2017 cuts are allowed to expire, there is no cap on SALT. That could arguably work better for them at home.
It absolutely could. It would also increase the ire of Donald Trump. Sure. So going back to my earlier point, which is they're going to have to pass something, and they will have to figure it out. But what every decision will make is how much political pain can they endure to deliver to Trump, what he wants. And if they do cut Medicaid or narrow it down, that is going to cause tremendous pain in the red states that Trump wants. The SALT also hits all those members that Eric listed. New York and California Republicans may be thrown out in the midterms, leading to Democratic members, which could flip the majority and stall his agenda. So there's so many layers to every decision that they're going to make here.
Well, and decisions do still have to be made. Eric, just in our final minute here, what's the likelihood that these markups currently scheduled for Tuesday get punted again?
I don't think they'll be punted, but I think, we may see a product come out that's less than satisfactory to every committee member and some last minute changes. I'm anticipating, for example, Ways and Means is going to meet at 2 p.m. on Tuesday. They may go all night onto World, completely exhausted, and then spring some compromise deal that we can barely understand, super complex, full of all kinds of loopholes on us, and we'll have to digest it. So I think it's gonna be very messy. I also think the House could vote on it in May, and we could see it fail and then come back. There's going to be a lot of fits and starts in this because it's going to be very, very hard to get the near unanimity that they need to pass this package.
Can you sense the excitement in Eric Wasson's voice here to have to cover all of this? Eric Wasson, Bloomberg congressional reporter, thank you so much, alongside Bloomberg senior editor Wendy Benjaminson here in Washington. Very much appreciated as we look forward to the events of next week here in D.C. It's going to be a big one for trying to advance this massive legislative agenda and get it through Congress as Memorial Day is quickly approaching. And we still have much more ahead here on Balance of Power. Up next, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino will join me. We'll turn to our political panel about the new nomination we got from President Trump last night for the district attorney in Washington. We'll have more ahead on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I'm Kailey Leinz in Washington, and indeed, you're listening to us on Bloomberg Radio or watching our Bloomberg feed on YouTube. Happy Friday to you all. And here at Bloomberg, of course, we don't consider ourselves to be in the business of necessarily discussing other media outlets, so please know what I'm about to say is not a comment around Fox News. It's simply purely an objective observation about how strong the Fox News to Trump administration pipeline continues to prove to be. Remember, two of President Trump's cabinet secretaries, the transportation secretary, Sean Duffy, and the defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, are former hosts on Fox News. There are dozens of others who are either in the president's orbit or in other roles in the administration who are formally affiliated with Fox and Fox Business as well. And as of last night, we have another name to add to the list here. Judge Janine Pirro, who, of course, was a host up until yesterday, I guess, of the five on Fox, has officially been tapped to be the interim U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia. After the president pulled the nomination of Ed Martin for the post, once it became clear his climb to Senate confirmation was going to be much more uphill and steeper than previously thought, Martin's now going to get a role at the Department of Justice instead. Those official roles will be the next Director of Weaponization Working Group, Associate Deputy Attorney General, and Pardon Attorney. So we want to get reaction to these developments and others and turn to our political panel on this Friday. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino are with me. Rick, of course, Republican strategist and Stone Court Capital partner. Jeannie, Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Welcome to you both. Rick, would love you to weigh in here, not just on the idea that Ed Martin's nomination had to be pulled and what that might signal, but that his interim replacement is once again someone whose face we recognize from television and one network in particular.
Yeah, no, this is right out of the playbook by Donald Trump. He really likes his team at Fox and, as you point out, has been mining them for his administration. It's worth noting that a contributor like Jeannie and I, Tulsi Gabbard from Fox, is also one of the more notorious members of the Trump administration. So shout out to contributors all over the place. But look, Judge Janine, she is a big sort of celebrity within Fox, but she had a career as a county judge and as a prosecutor in Westchester County, New York, which was extremely successful. I mean, she has got the credits, the capability, and the experience you need to serve in this post. So it's not just a Fox News analyst or participatory a journalist. It's somebody who actually was a prosecutor and a judge and has a lot of experience here.
So, Jeannie, is she qualified?
I have to tell you, Kailey, Janine Pirro was my Westchester County DA for many, many years.
The world is small.
It's a small world. Shout out to contributors and DAs everywhere. It's just fascinating because one of the reasons that Tom Tillis, who's really the linchpin of this entire move from Martin to Judge Janine, as we call her, was because of his role primarily in the January 6th incident and also obviously supporting the pardons of the January 6th rioters. And yet, if you listen carefully to Judge Janine, and it really doesn't take to be very careful, but if you just listen to Fox News, she has said a number of things that really leave you scratching your head if you're listening to Tom Tillis, because there's not a lot of difference between what Martin was saying and what Judge Janine has said about January 6th. In fact, she's named in these two big defamation lawsuits, the Dominion voting one, which obviously Fox News ended up settling. Some of that was about things that she had said on the air. So that to me is one of the fascinating areas here. And yet, despite that, Tom Tillis goes on Twitter and says, this is a great appointment on Judge Janine's part. So, it's interesting to see how this is playing out. She seems to be more politically palatable, despite the fact she's no more independent from Donald Trump in the White House. And her views are very similar to Martin's on the issue of January 6th.
Well, I'm glad she's raising Tom Tillis here, Rick, because one of the most memorable lines from you I think we've gotten here on Bloomberg this year was when you said everybody sometimes wants to be a John McCain and they end up a Tom Tillis, when he notably did not defy the Republican Party with a few of Trump's other nominees earlier this year for higher profile cabinet posts. What is it about Ed Martin that finally got a Republican senator to step out of line with the party?
Well, I'm pretty sure he was listening to me and not thinking about Ed Martin, right? I mean, look, Senator Tillis makes the case, and I think it is a differentiator to Judge Janine, that Ed was someone who actually participated in the protest, the march to the Capitol. Reports have it that he didn't enter the Capitol. But he was an activist in the effort, and then really didn't just comment about it on TV. He actively represented members and lobbied hard for their commutation. So I think you would have to consider him in a different subset than someone who just comments about it on TV. But look, I think all these folks in the Senate, especially as it relates to controversial nominations, are feeling their way. They're trying to think through, how far they can go. There was a rally around the cabinet initially, get them in place, do it early, do it historically early. But I think now you've got some folks who are, thinking, gee, maybe we shouldn't just be a rubber stamp and start feeling our way through some of these nominees who may not be qualified to serve.
Well, and when we consider other nominees, I would note, Jeannie, that it wasn't just Ed Martin's that was pulled this week. Trump also abandoned his original pick for Surgeon General in favor of Casey Means. And I wonder if you see that as a signal at this point, when he was able to get all of his at least highest profile cabinet level positions filled with record speed, as Rick was alluding to, and with relative ease, with the exception of Matt Gaetz. Does it even matter if he has to pull them at this point?
I think he feels that in the case of Means, he said, this was somebody who came highly recommended by Kennedy, who he trusts enormously. He said he doesn't know her well, but based on what he has heard and the recommendation, he was fine going with her. But I think it shows in both cases that the president feels he has other priorities that are taking precedent over a big fight in the Senate, if that's what it would be, about a confirmation that's on the edge. And this Martin's one was going to be on the edge when you look at some of what had come out about him hosting and praising on his podcast somebody who spoke, about Hitler, dressed up as Hitler, said horrible things, horribly anti-Semitic things. This was the kind of thing that was going to come out in the Senate confirmation hearing. And so Does the president really want to waste, political capital on that? Probably not. So you would fight for those upper level positions, but now he's starting to say he's got other priorities. Of course, number one being getting that reconciliation bill. So I think that's what we're starting to see here with some of these other appointments. That's not to say they're not important, but the president isn't willing to waste a lot of political capital on them.
And while we're discussing current nominees and nominations, I also want to talk about a nomination that was made decades ago that we're reflecting on today. And that was the nomination made by then President George H.W. Bush for David Souter to get a seat on the Supreme Court. He was thought at the time to be a conservative pick, and his tenure on the court maybe proved otherwise. Rick, he died this week at 85, peacefully, we understand, at his home in New Hampshire. And I wonder your thoughts as to how we should be reflecting on that legacy.
Yeah, this might have been the greatest surprise in the last 50 years as far as an appointment under the Supreme Court. I remember it very clearly as a young Reagan conservative thinking, wow, this is an incredible opportunity to put a conservative on the court. And of course, my great friend, late Senator Warren Rudman, picked this one out of his back pocket from New Hampshire and stunned the world. And when George H.W. Bush, President Reagan's vice president, appointed him, I think people were floored. And it was not a shock or a surprise that he wound up being as moderate a Supreme Court justice as he turned out to be. But really an amazing period of time then. We see a lot of the debates around things like Roe v. Wade happening then that happened in the first Trump administration. So it is a little bit of deja vu all over again. But may he rest in peace, a great servant of the people of our nation, and somebody who I think considered the law the highest calling in the land, and certainly served honorably.
Well, and Jeannie, as we consider his tenure on the court and his service for 19 years on the high court, are we ever going to see someone like that again, given how partisan and politically tinged the court seems to have become?
I don't think so. I think one of the things we see, and Souter is a good example of this, is future administrations learn from past administrations. And in this case, the H.W. Bush administration described Souter as the biggest mistake of his presidency. I don't know if that is something that everybody would agree with, but certainly, he was in a camp like Earl Warren. Earl Warren appointed and then becomes this, really, really the most liberal lion of the Supreme Court ever and Chief Justice. Souter, not quite as impactful, but certainly in the latter part of the 20th century, had a big voice on the court. And so I don't know that we'll see this. He's also something of a throwback in so many ways, Kailey. Here was somebody who wrote decisions longhand on pen and paper, famously decried technology. Here was somebody, they said, every day took a lunch in a plastic bag of a yogurt and an apple to the office and ate by himself. And here's somebody who retired after, as you mentioned, just 19 years at the young age of 69 to go back home to New Hampshire and continue to serve the public there. And so in so many ways, also a traditional sort of New England-ish Republican that you don't see a lot of anymore. So in so many ways, a throwback to an earlier era. And it's sad for me personally, because I don't know that we're going to see that again, at least in the near future.
Have we seen, though, Rick, glimpses of it in Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who earlier this year was getting a lot of flack from the right for multiple times siding against the Trump administration when she wasn't expected to?
Yeah, I think certainly my experience is you never really know what you get with a Supreme Court appointment until they've started a ruling. And I would say not just Amy Coney Barrett, but Brett Kavanaugh, I think, has been a surprise to some conservatives who thought he would be a very conservative judge, and even Neil Gorsuch has surprised some with his ruling. So I think that this court currently is particularly interesting because they are not following just a very clear conservative line every time there's an issue in front of the docket.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
It's another one of those weeks where there's so much news that sometimes you don't have enough time to talk about it all. Like yesterday, for example, we got the first post-Liberation Day trade deal or framework between the U.S. and the United Kingdom, and we got history made in Rome with the election of a new American pope. And with those things going on, you'd be forgiven if you missed the Bloomberg scoop that the Treasury Department was actually developing a fast-track process for screening foreign investments in the U.S. through CPHAS, an effort that this administration, the Trump administration, expects could smooth the way for billions of dollars from foreign sovereign wealth funds to come into the United States. Sovereign wealth funds from countries like the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Qatar. No coincidence that those happen to be three countries where President Trump will be visiting next week as he makes a trip to the Middle East. And obviously, in addition to foreign investment, there's a lot of other things he is likely to discuss there. And that's what we want to get into now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm pleased to say joining me is Hagar Shamali. She is now the CEO of Greenwich Media Strategies and founder, but also former director of Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council. And here with me in our Washington, D.C. studio. Hagar, good to see you as always.
Thanks for having me.
Obviously, this is going to be a very big week for the president. There is a lot he'd like to discuss with the UAE and the Saudis and Qatar specifically. How should we consider the kind of financial aspect of this relationship as he's courting investment from these countries into the U.S. and how that influences actually the shape of those alliances and the positioning of geopolitics in the Middle East?
Yeah, that's such a good question. No one is framing it that way, by the way. And because one of the most important pieces of this is actually an economic route that started under the Biden administration and is now being continued under the Trump administration. One of the real policies actually that's being continued called IMEC. So something where you're going India, Middle East, Europe, fashioning this corridor, if you will, to not only encourage economic trade with all of these continents and locations and regions, but also a lot of that is about becoming a counterweight to China. And so that's going to be a lot of the focus of this trip. There are going to be many things actually that they're going to discuss that are not economic as well. But a lot of that too is making sure you're pulling Saudi Arabia from China, you're pulling the region away from China, ensuring that Saudi Arabia is trying to diversify its economy. They're interested in all sorts of investments back and forth. And so they're going to be looking for that, certainly an increase in any kind of trade related to defense equipment as well. That's something that Saudi Arabia struggles with Democrats and has better luck with Republicans. So they're going to be talking about things like that as well.
Well, and for the UAE especially, we know there's kind of chip considerations as well. Bloomberg has had some reporting on whether or not the administration is likely to lift chip restrictions on the UAE in particular. To your point, the whole point of that is to try to make sure those chips ultimately don't find their way to China. So maybe a lot of this does come back to China, but a lot of this is about this region as well in the current environment in the Middle East. When we consider the engagement we've seen from this administration so far with Israel as it relates to the ongoing conflict in Gaza, with Saudi Arabia as they look to expand the Abraham Accords, what really is, for Middle East purposes, objective number one for the president, do you think?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of wins for the president to achieve in Saudi Arabia. And one of the ones at the top of the list is the discussions that would lead to peace deals, a number of peace deals. They want to increase the Abraham Accords, increase the countries under the Abraham Accords as much as possible. The president, and I'm not trying to say this lightly, he is focused on a Nobel Peace Prize through the Abraham Accords. And he's been very clear about that, right? He was clear about that the first time around and now the second time around. And a lot of that, a big chunk of that is really through Saudi Arabia. Not all of the countries, but Saudi Arabia would be a big one because you'd get a lot of others in its trail. And those talks are talks that have already existed, right? So they've been going on for a while, really since the end of Trump's term, Trump 1.0. And so that's really, they're going to be continuing those talks. Now, there are certain things, elements of those talks initially that appears that they're also being pulled out. Things like discussing civil nuclear partnerships, things of that kind that were originally going to be part of a normalization deal or peace deal. And it looks as though that might be pulled out. But nonetheless, I think it'll all be in the context of getting to a final destination, and that destination being having Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries under the Abraham Accords.
What timeline do you think is realistic for that? This visit, I would imagine, is not going to be alone in accomplishing that.
No. Well, and the Saudis, unlike other countries, they've made it clear, and I don't think that they're going to backtrack on their insistence that there be the promise of a Palestinian state. It doesn't mean that one needs to be necessarily created or recognized, but that there be some kind of process to get there. And that's going to hamper things a little bit. I mean, if I were a betting woman, it's hard to say, maybe 2027. Sometimes I think it'll be in a year or so. And then other times there are days where I'm like, this is really happening. And then there are days where I think maybe another 2 years.
Yeah, well, every day is different around here, that's for sure. But to your point on there being some kind of day after long-term solution for the Palestinians in Gaza, where even are we on those conversations, on the idea of renewing any kind of ceasefire agreement or bringing some kind of end to this conflict? Because the administration was very focused on that, very proud of the deal reached on the eve of Trump's negotiation. And then what happened?
Yeah, and it's funny, the last time I was on, which was maybe 10 days ago, we discussed this, and there were a number of deals that were going back and forth, and there was a deal proposed by the Israelis that was rejected, then the Egyptians and Qataris had come in, and we are now really, unfortunately, in a spot where we've gone completely backwards. The war is being actively expanded by Israel in Gaza. It's a decision by the cabinet, but also more importantly, it was a decision that very clearly laid out that the hostages were not being prioritized. We don't know, but we believe between now, we're hearing between 21 and 24 who are alive. I don't want to make any kind of assertion on this, but anyway, every day that passes is a risk for them. And we know that. And the cabinet really came out crystal clear and said, we are prioritizing the expansion of this because they have Hamas by the neck and they want to crush them completely. And as somebody who works in counterterrorism, I want nothing more than to see Hamas obliterated. My own opinion is I'm not sure I understand why they can't cut a deal, get the hostages released, and then do targeted operations as they have in Lebanon, for example. But because I'm completely behind the idea of crushing Hamas completely.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's Bibi's clearly very intent on that singular goal.
So what role does the U.S. play in influencing Israel in any of this, knowing that Israel also maybe have taken aback by some of the Trump administration's recent actions, including declaring a truce with the Houthis seemingly out of nowhere?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. So actually the Israelis, and this I think is a bit indicative of how things might go between the United States and Israel, is Bibi has been blindsided by the Trump administration a number of times now. So first you had, for example, the talks that were taking place directly with Hamas on the release of American hostages. You have the Iran talks, and now you have this deal that the U.S. administration cut with the Houthis, where the Houthis have promised not to target American vessels in the Red Sea, but that's it. Just the American vessels. And that deal not only blindsided Bibi, according to press reports, but it indicates it's very demonstrative of an America First policy, right? We care about our vessels, we care about our national security objectives only, and what is directly American, and we're going to pursue that unapologetically. And that makes it difficult. While Bibi seems to listen to Trump and has a lot of respect for him, or Trump has a lot of clout with Bibi, those kind of efforts are going to make it more difficult for the U.S. to push Bibi where they want.
You raised Iran in that last answer, and I do want to talk about that as well. As we learned today, another round of talks between the U.S. and Iran will take place this weekend, on Sunday specifically, in Oman. And I wonder how you see progress here, because we are still talking. This is the next round of talks in what has been a line of them in succession. But how far still does that put us from actually reaching some kind of agreement with Iran?
Yeah. So this one in particular, the thing that I think so important to talk about these talks is that what I see a lot in the public discourse out there is that, it's just a repeat of what the JCPOA under President Obama.
Is that thinking wrong?
He's completely wrong.
Okay.
He's completely wrong. And I worked on that deal as a spokesperson. I was Treasury spokesperson at the time. time. I worked on that deal when it was happening under President Obama. This is completely different. This is based on an assessment that Iran is very close to a nuclear weapon, that would fundamentally change things in the Middle East and would trigger an arms race and completely change our national security problems there. Then that means that it inevitably could lead to a military solution, and that these talks are a last-ditch effort. So the talks are a last-ditch effort, and unlike the ones under Obama, they don't go into the nitty-gritty of how many centrifuges can they have, which centrifuges where in Iran, how much can those centrifuges operate, how much uranium. No, it's very singularly focused on you, Iran, can never have a nuclear weapon. There is no timeline. It's never. If you don't agree, the U.S. or Israel, whichever, will bomb those nuclear facilities. And that is a threat Iran takes very seriously, because in October, Israel bombed the defense systems around those nuclear facilities and Tehran, and the Iranian regime is very weak at the moment, so they can't risk that.
So would they agree?
They are in a position where these talks could go well to agree, because they're desperate for a win, given that they're on the defense and that they need to survive and that they need sanctions lifted. But I don't know that everybody across the Middle East is happy about that, by the way. I don't think the Saudis are very excited about that. I know that those who are working against Hezbollah in Lebanon are not excited about that. They want nothing more, me included, to see the Iranian regime crushed.
Well, so President Trump could get an earful about this. He's not just coming to these countries with his own objectives. They probably have things they want to say to him in return.
Absolutely. And I believe the Trump administration, from everything I've seen and those I've spoken to, there is a very large focus on this question of triggering a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. That is what incentivized these talks. And you even saw it with the Vice President, J.D. Vance. He said earlier this week that he's hoping that these talks could open the door for talks with China and Russia to talk about decreasing their nuclear weapons altogether, that everybody could. That's very, by the way, Reagan-esque way of looking at things. It's a positive goal, regardless of what people like me think of the Iranian regime. And so that's how they're going to couch it. And they're going to go to Saudi Arabia and say, listen, this is important. This is a priority. You need to support us, even if it's quietly behind the scenes, and let us do this. But I have no doubt that it will come with some kind of exchange of some kind, as it did under President Obama, whether it's defense equipment deals or whatever.
Well, we'll have to look and see how all of this pans out next week. Good to see you as always, Hagar. Thank you for being here. Hagar Shamali, former director for Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council, now founder and CEO at Greenwich Media Strategies, here with us on Balance of Power.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.